Yes.
Dr. Snape, I'd like to turn, if we may, to the PFL and its relationship with BPL. I won't bring it up yet, but you set out from paragraph 49 in your statement the origins of PFL and the fact that it formed part of what you describe as the Oxford Triangle, with the Oxford Hemophilia Centre, the Nuffield Orthopaedic Centre, and the Oxford Regional Transfusion Centre. Could you just explain to the inquiry what the significance of the North Oxford Triangle was from your perspective as someone who worked within PFL?
Yes. It reflected, first of all, the geographic location of the three departments. They were very close together. Both the PFL and the Transfusion Centre in the 70s, the Transfusion Centre was still on the Churchill Hospital site. The Nuffield Orthopaedic Centre, the NOC, was on an adjacent site, possibly half a mile away from the Hemophilia Centre, PFL, and the Transfusion Centre. And there was very, very close working relationship between them. It was not unusual for haemophilic patients who had joint problems to be referred to Professor Duthie at the NOC, and for follow-up treatment to be carried out under the agency of the Hemophilia Centre. The relationship with the blood centre facilitated the way PFL in particular received most of its plasma from the Oxford Blood Transfusion Centre, typically in 5-litre packs. So that close relationship and the fact that patient families gravitated to the Oxford area for the benefit of being treated at the Hemophilia Centre, and then with complications treated at the NOC, is the background to the term.
Did you have much contact yourself with the clinicians at the Hemophilia Centre?
Yes, daily. My entry into PFL was through the main entrance to the Hemophilia Centre. I would stop and chat with physicians and patients if there were those waiting. I was also, I lived in the same village as Charles Ritzer, and for several years we shared transport in from that village to the Hemophilia Centre. So I was as close as it could possibly be without actually working in the Hemophilia Centre. And I was instructed on joining PFL, I was instructed by Ethel Bidwell that there was a good opportunity every Saturday morning when Charles Ritzer and James Matthews and other physicians, Peter Kernoff, were meeting over coffee. I shouldn't miss the opportunity to join them for coffee every Saturday morning for a review of what was happening and what was new and what was important and what their needs were.
Did you have much contact with their patients as well, or just the clinicians?
I had contacts with patients when I would sometimes out of hours be contacted by one of the physicians to come in because one of our products, which was on limited release, typically something like factor 7 or maybe factor 9, because stocks of factor 9 in the early 70s were up and down. I'd be called out to make product available. I'd make up a dose, and I'd take it down to the Hemophilia Centre to see it administered by the treating physician.
If I could take you, please, to your statement, WITN 3431001, page 20, paragraph 52. I'm just going to read paragraphs 52 and 53 to you. It starts by picking up on a phrase that you had used earlier in your statement. You wrote this: I have described PFL as the coagulation factor pilot plant for BPL, but its contribution to coagulation factor production was greater than that. The pilot plant usually undertakes processing on a reduced scale, typically 1/10 of the ultimate full manufacturing scale, and functions as the interface between development and manufacturing. PFL did indeed undertake coagulation factor process development on behalf of BPL, but from its establishment in 1967 until the late 1970s, its output of factor VIII and the scale on which coagulation factor processing was undertaken were similar to the output and scale of operation at BPL. This is not to suggest that PFL's throughput was especially large in the 1970s. It wasn't. Rather, the fact is that BPL's throughput of plasma to coagulation factors during the same period was small, reflecting inadequate facilities and staffing limitations at Elstree for coagulation factor production, as well as the limited quantity of recovered plasma available to it. Put simply, the primary focus on BPL at Elstree had, until around 1978, been the manufacture and supply of albumin and immunoglobulin products. In fact, in the first half of the 1970s, PFL's factor VIII output, manufactured almost exclusively from plasma supplied by the regional transfusion centre in Oxford, was a significant part, perhaps 50%, of the total factor VIII supply to haemophilia centres in England and Wales. You then refer to a table which is attached to your chronology. And from that, you point out that in 1978, the combined total of BPL and PFL's factor VIII output was 14.6 million international units, compared with 19.2 million international units of imported factor VIII and 11.177 million international units of cryoprecipitate. You go on to say, and I quote, I don't have access to detailed records showing the proportions manufactured on the two sites by 1978, but my memory is that it was about 15% at PFL to 85% at BPL, the factor VIII output from BPL having been substantially increased after 1975. Can we take it from that, then, that during the 70s, and particularly after 1975, as demand grew for factor concentrates, greater investment was made in BPL as a way of meeting the demand for factor concentrate, and PFL resumed or took up its role as more of a pilot plant for BPL. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, but with a qualification. The factor VIII output of PFL was always going to be limited by the site. I mentioned before the break that it was possible from 75 onwards, a decision was taken that not to process supernatants at PFL to albumin or IgGs, but to ship them to Elstree. That gave Jim Smith an opportunity to use extra time for factor VIII manufacturing, but it was only up to the point that the facility allowed. At Elstree, over the same period, yes, there was expansion, there was focus with the appointment of certainly with Norman Pettit as who later became assistant to the director, but at the time was a factor VIII scientist and supporting Drummond Ellis in his coagulation factor management role. There was significant effort at BPL to increase output.
The inquiry has heard over the last couple of weeks about that increase in demand for factor concentrate in England and Wales, and the fact that it came at the expense of demand for cryoprecipitate. Now, I'm not going to ask you to go into the pros and cons of cryoprecipitate against factor concentrates, because that's something the inquiry has heard quite a bit of evidence about. But from your perspective, working at PFL, and from speaking to the clinicians in PFL, is it your understanding that the demand for cryoprecipitate was led by the clinicians, or was it the fact that the fractionators were making more of a factor concentrate that led to the clinicians taking it up?
I think it was both, and it was different in different centres. There's no doubt that the Hemophilia Centre at Oxford had access. First of all, it had probably, as far as I'm aware, more patients, more haemophilic patients than most other centres, if not all other centres. And they did have access to freeze-dried factor VIII concentrates of one form or another from PFL. And the stock holding was right next door to them. I don't know. I couldn't tell you at what point in the history of the Hemophilia Centre at Oxford the shift from cryo to concentrate took place. I'm sure it was as fast as we could make factor VIII concentrate for them.
When you say you're sure it was as fast as you could make factor VIII concentrate for them, that suggests that it was them asking you for it rather than PFL foisting it upon them. Is that fair?
Oh, that's absolutely true. Yes. We were very much driven by the needs of the Hemophilia Centre.
To the best of your knowledge, did either PFL or BPL seek at that time to promote their own factor concentrates as an alternative to cryoprecipitate, or were they simply reacting to the demand that was made of them by clinicians?
I did not have, at that time, a patient-facing or a physician-facing role, but I believe we were reacting. We were not promoting, and I think I can recall occasions when we were criticised for not being more proactive, for not promoting BPL and PFL and their products.
Who made those criticisms?
Hemophilia Centre directors. Although I didn't attend Hemophilia Centre directors meetings as of right, I was often invited to join them, just as Jim Smith was, and they were good opportunities to chat and to get a feeling for what attitudes were. But certainly, there were certainly some physicians who would have preferred that we promoted our products and services actively.
You describe in paragraphs 54 to 56 of your statement some of the other products that were made at PFL. I'm not going to go to those now, but I flag them for the future consideration of others. Briefly, if I may, if we leap forward to March 1992, a decision was made to close PFL, and it's one that you say that you were not happy with. Why did you oppose the closure of PFL?
I felt there was synergy between the pilot plant at Oxford and the team there and the manufacturing team at Elstree. There wasn't at that time an equivalent coagulation factor development team, and it seemed to me quite short-sighted to be closing PFL rather than capitalizing on it with limited expenditure. The team was more than just Jim Smith and Lowell Winkleman and David Evans. It was a group of people who'd put an awful lot of effort into and were very good at clotting factor product development.
I'd like to turn now to the question of the management structures for BPL and for PFL. You say in your statement, it's paragraph 42, I won't bring it up on screen, that it was your personal impression that BPL and plasma products were given lower priority by the Lister Institute than blood group research and vaccine development when the Lister Institute had a management responsibility for BPL. First of all, is that a correct summary of your views?
Yes.
Why did you think that?
Because no, that's very difficult to be objective. It seemed to me that clotting factor plasma products manufacture, but in particular coagulation factor development and production, was the poor relation in the process. The science existed in blood group reference activities, in the vaccines activities that had made the Lister Institute what it was. The directors of the Lister Institute were essentially vaccinologists. They were blood group people. As far as I know, Sir William Maycock was the only coagulation factor representative on that body, and it showed in terms of the way priorities were judged.
What was the effect of this lack of priority that was given to BPL and plasma coagulation factors?
Well, it took a long time to build up the coagulation factor production at Elstree. It was slow to happen, and it depended on the injection of expertise and enthusiasm from PFL at Oxford, from people like Ethel Bidwell, and when he moved over to Oxford, from Jim Smith, and myself.
This is a period in the early 1970s when the Lister Institute had a management role. What input, if any, did the DHSS have at that time in terms of encouraging the development of Elstree and BPL?
Until the intervention of David Lord Owen, it wasn't. I couldn't have told you what encouragement came or what direction came from the Department of Health. That Lord Owen's intervention in 1975 was a breath of fresh air, and in that sense was very, very welcome.
We've looked at the amount of money that BPL received as a result of the intervention of Lord Owen. And I won't take you through the detail of that. Presumably at this stage, with you at PFL, you didn't have any direct role in how that money was spent or what was done with it.
No, I'm not even sure at the time that I would have been particularly aware of it. I had to go back and dig to find evidence of effectively how much was spent on BPL as opposed to the transfusion service.
One of the questions that the chair is going to have to consider is why it was that in that mid-1970s period, there wasn't a push for a wider scale redevelopment of BPL along the lines of the redevelopment that took place in the 1980s. Are you able to assist at all with why that didn't take place?
I can't provide evidence or even anecdote of why it didn't take place, other than partly the ponderous nature of decision making in some parts of the Department of Health, and partly shifts in key people at the Department of Health that might have slowed down decisions. I mean, it's a big. One of the biggest decisions, for example, would be whether or not a large sum of money should be spent on building a new factory, or a progressive trickle of money, making the existing facility work better and produce more.
In terms of Dr. Maycock, did you have much interaction with him during his time as director of BPL?
Oh, once or twice a month. He would either visit PFL, or I would accompany Ethel Bidwell to Elstree, and we'd join him for discussions, often discussions where he was using Ethel Bidwell's understanding and expertise to assist him in getting a better understanding. For example, understanding of how much factor rate was needed in practice.
How much of a grip, as it were, did you feel Dr. Maycock had on how much factor rate was going to be needed in that mid-70s period?
When you say how much of a grip, do you mean how good was his assessment?
Yes.
Probably, I think he'd be he would have been the first to say that he found it difficult because the numbers shifted. It depended a lot on who was presenting the information. It also depended on some assumptions that were very shaky. Probably, I mean, the number of hemophiliacs was reasonably well understood, albeit the difference between the number of seriously affected hemophiliacs was probably well known. The yield of products, and therefore how much from recovered from plasma, and therefore how much plasma would be needed to make all of the demands of the hemophiliacs, was shifting and very much depended on who you talk to. There was a completely different perception of yield at south of the border and in Scotland. So that would change from, I'm sure, from Dr. Maycock's perception. That would make decisions, judgments on how much plasma was needed very difficult to arrive at.
How would you compare Dr. Maycock's leadership at BPL with that of Dr. Lane, his successor?
Oh, gosh. Fundamentally different. Dr. Maycock was old school, a product of the army medical corps background. Richard Lane was a visionary, a planner, and remarkably good at, I want to say encouraging, but it's more than encouraging, remarkably good at getting a lot out of people.
Just on the question of planning rather than the question of motivating, to your mind, did Dr. Maycock have a plan about how BPL was going to develop to meet the needs of the clinicians for factor VIII concentrates as they grew in the 1970s?
I'm not sure I can answer you. I didn't have that level of privy conversation with him.
I understand. I will leave it there. We have heard about the changes in management from North West Thames Regional Health Authority, to North West Thames Regional Health Authority and the Joint Management Committee, and then to the CBLA in December 1982. You say in your statements at paragraph 44 that the CBLA have their headquarters on site at Elstree in a building called the Crest, but you don't recall any visits by CBLA members to the manufacturing or quality control facilities at BPL, other than from Dr. Lane himself. Is that right?
Yes. I mean, I can't tell you why that. I know why Richard Lane came into the manufacturing facility. It was to be seen and to encourage. I don't know why. The CBLA met, I think, on a 2-monthly basis. They were in that meeting in the Crest, and I guess they were busy enough not to feel the need to leave.
Was that a disappointment to you?
Yes.
In terms of the wider management style of the CBLA, does that lack of visits indicate a wider, more hands-off management style?
It was certainly hands-off. I don't know that it was deliberately hands-off, as much as we're busy, we have our job to do, you have your job to do, and let's leave it there.
You have spoken a little earlier about how decisions were arrived at through committee meetings and also passed down from the DHSS and the CBLA to BPL. How powerful a role did Dr. Lane have as director in terms of setting out the priorities and the funding of those priorities at BPL?
Do you mean internally powerful, or do you mean how powerful was he in conveying that and then getting what he wanted from the Department of Health?
Both. Let's start with internal.
Okay. Yes, he was powerful in that his presence was recognised, his drive was recognised, and he would make clear what he expected and needed to be done.
Would he also listen and take advice from other members of the BPL team?
Yes, well, certainly I can speak for myself. I'd like to think I could speak probably for Jim Smith. He certainly listened and took notice of what we said. I probably wasn't involved with him in meetings with other members of the team. For example, the head of R&D or or finance. But yeah, yes, I mean, I think he listened and he acted on the basis of what he heard.
Let's turn to the external question. How effective was Dr. Lane in being able to convey and obtain what he wanted from the Department of Health and Social Security and the CBLA?
I'm almost stepping outside my area of knowledge, but it seemed to me that he was conveying quite powerfully what he believed needed to happen and was needed to make it happen. How effective he was in getting what he wanted would depend on who he was interacting with. There were some Department of Health officials that he worked more effectively with than others.
I think we will leave it there in terms of your knowledge. Is it fair to say that you weren't usually in those meetings between Dr. Lane and members of the Department of Health?
I can't think of any meetings of that kind where I was present, except, for example, meetings of either the Hemophilia Centre directors or the Transfusion Centre directors, where I would have been there as an invited participant, but not. Those weren't really policy making fora.
What input did the Hemophilia Centre directors have in guiding the direction of BPL and PFL?
They were effective in terms of the Hepatitis Working Party under John Krask was probably the most obvious frequent influencer on BPL and PFL in terms of conveying information based on analysis of HCD returns and also returns from PFL. I'm sorry, I've lost your question.
I was asking about the wider influence of Hemophilia Centre directors on the direction of BPL and PFL. And you've answered in respect of the Hemophilia Working Centre, the Hepatitis Working Party, sorry.
Yeah. I mean, Arthur Bloom was, of course, a member of CBLA for, I'm not sure for what period. And so in that sense, he would have made input. I don't know how else they would have made input until when Norman Pettit was moved from his coagulation factor production role into his assistant to the director role. Then information came back through Norman Pettit to BPL from the Hemophilia Centre directors on their views, and that certainly was helpful.
When you say feedback came from Hemophilia Centre directors, would it come back from a wide variety of Hemophilia Centre directors, or did certain names and certain voices tend to dominate?
Well, first, obviously, the reference centre directors would have been the dominant voices. But that's not to say that the wider Hemophilia Centre director forum didn't feed back as well, but more often, I suspect, through Norman Pettit and Richard Lane. There's no doubt that someone like Charles Ritzer was very good at keeping Ethel Bidwell, keeping me, keeping Jim Smith informed, and he was a good yardstick as well.
Finally, on management structures, not finally on management structures, but before I turn to that final question, that's for Hemophilia Centre directors. What about individual members of the haemophilia community or the groups of individuals from the haemophilia community, did they have any input into the direction of BPL and PFL?
The only a couple of names come to mind. I mean, Reverend Tanner was good at maintaining links, and David Waters was also a good source and kept us on our toes.
Coming then to my final question on this topic, in 1993, there was a change of management structure to the National Blood Authority. What difference did that make to the way in which BPL was managed?
I'll speak first of all for myself. The result was very positive. It was easier to function as to feel that we were functioning as part of a team, something that I'd felt was missing, especially when I compared it with what I saw in Scotland. In terms of the change for, I'm sure there was more explicit direction in terms of financial affairs through Barry Savory, who had been a BPL entity and was then part of the authority. It was possible to get information up and back down the chain more easily.
I'd like to turn to the connected issue then of the relationship before the establishment of the National Blood Authority between BPL and the regional transfusion centres. Am I right in thinking that those are the other parts of the team that you didn't feel connected with before the NBA?
Yes, I mean, they worked very hard, but we were not always necessarily working. It was a little bit like being in rowing in an 8, and occasionally looking to see that one of the members of the 8 is pointing in the opposite direction, or at least not knowing which direction the boat's going.
May I just ask a question? I understood your statement as saying, in one sense, you were in different boats, because your statement, I think, makes the point, as I've understood it, tell me if I'm wrong, that your sense was that BPL and PFL were not parts of the National Blood Transfusion Service.
We were not.
So you were separate, in effect, even though you had to get your supplies from the NBTS, you were not in the same organisation.
That's true, sir. Also, I couldn't have told you, certainly at the time, whether there were common goals, for example, on quality or quantity in terms of plasma.
Yes.
If that makes sense.
Yes, it does.
The way that you describe it in your statement at paragraph 64 is, and I quote, BPL and PFL existed alongside the National Blood Transfusion Service, but was not part of it. Is that an accurate summary?
Yes. For my part, I mean, I only had one typical link with the centres, and that was in terms of plasma quality. But it often seemed to me that I was having to beat a different drum depending on which transfusion centre I went to, and also that I had to work very hard to make sure that whilst we may not have been formally within the same organisation, to convey the fact that we really wanted to be part of their organisation.
You also refer, paragraph 72 of your statement, to the fact that the independence of regional transfusion centres was, in your words, fiercely defended. Can you just expand on that a little?
Yes. It seemed to me that despite the role that Bill Maycock might have had, despite the role that Harold Gunson subsequently had, at the end of the day, they were individual fiefdoms, and there were things that were protected, and they might have been priorities in terms of, for example, whether plasmapheresis was appropriate, whether SAGM was the direction to go in. It took a lot of convincing that the IPP, or the single plasma pack, was the right thing to do. So, yeah, they did defend their independence quite fiercely.
Dr. Maycock's dual role that you mentioned there, director of BPL, also consultant advisor on blood transfusion to the DHSS before Dr. Tovey and then Dr. Gunson. Did that, in your view, assist in trying to coordinate the work of BPL and the regional transfusion centres?
Gosh. I'm an ant crawling over a very complex tapestry, and I just see the next little bit. I can't really answer that. I'm sorry.
Very well. We'll move on. You mentioned that your interaction with the regional transfusion centres concerned plasma supply and plasma quality. I'd just like to take you, please, to paragraph 91 on page 33 of your statement, WITN 3431001. If we could just pick it up towards the end of that paragraph with the words, "we were well aware." You say this: "We were well aware that the 14 regional transfusion centres supplying plasma to BPL, PFL were not necessarily equivalent in this regard, some consistently supplying plasma with higher factor VIII content than others. We would later be able to demonstrate that these differences were multifactorial and included the physical arrangements for and the rate of freezing of the plasma and storage temperature, as well as donor-related factors like blood group." And you give a reference there to an article that you and Dr. Smith wrote on this topic. The reference is PRSE 40434. We won't go to it, but I leave that for the transcript. The inquiry has heard that this variability in plasma quality was a regular cause of concern for Dr. Lane. What steps could BPL take to try to improve the quality of plasma that it was provided with?
We needed to be better at feeding back what we found when plasma was delivered to us. We needed to make sure that they understood how often we saw plasma that, for example, had excessive hemolysis, red cell hemolysis, or highly lipemic, highly fatty plasma. We had to be aware that, and to feed back to them, a very tempting proposition for a transfusion centre would be to go for Group A donors who were typically high in factor VIII and to push up the factor VIII content. But that, attractive as that might be in terms of factor VIII, it wasn't necessarily a good idea to shift the balance of blood group in the plasma that we process. A constant battle was how to convince centres that the orientation of plasma bags in the freezer, so that the bag froze flat, so that they could be opened more easily and the plasma recovered better, that it was important to freeze relatively quickly and then store at constant temperature. It was important to make sure that the storage didn't result in the pigtails, the lines into the pack, didn't break off. They couldn't be expected to know that if BPL didn't feed back the information to them. And so a lot of what we had to achieve was to get that information back. Then I think the one thing that we did, and I believe did well at the time, was the introduction of I call it the IPP, you call it the SPP, with the characteristics of that bag. But we also had to be aware that the transfusion centres would see that as handing a blank check to Baxter, for example, our collaborators with the IPP, and that we had to be seen to be punctiliously correct in how we managed that relationship.
All of these things that you describe involved BPL seeking to persuade regional transfusion centres because you couldn't direct them. Is that a fair way of putting it?
Yes.
The single plasma pack, or the international plasma pack, we looked at that a couple of weeks ago at the inquiry. From the papers, it seems that the initiative for that development came primarily from Dr. Lane, whilst he was director designate. To the best of your knowledge, is that correct?
Yep, that's correct.
Another initiative that was introduced was the pro rata scheme of blood product distribution, which came into effect in April 1981, so before you moved to BPL. Did you have any involvement in setting up the pro rata scheme?
I had no involvement in setting up the scheme. I had discussions with Norman Pettit and, of course, with Richard Lane on how it might work. To me, it seemed to make sense, but I know there were different opinions across the transfusion service. Different directors saw it differently.
Looking back on the scheme, do you think it did have the effect that it was intended to have, to improve the quantity and quality of plasma that was supplied to BPL?
I thought that it did, yes. I was a little surprised to hear, for example, to hear the criticism of the scheme from Dr. Wagstaff a couple of months ago. But I guess I shouldn't have been surprised, because different regions got more from pro rata than others.
Just on a technical point about pro rata, I don't know if you will be able to assist us with this. It's easy to see how the quantity of plasma can be assessed and then blood products given back according to that quantity. How was the quality of plasma assessed so that that formed part of the equation for how much product a region would get back?
I don't think it was.
Thank you. What role did BPL have in determining how donors should be recruited or tested at regional transfusion centres?
If you're asking me about how do we interact with individual centres to do it, I don't know that we did particularly well. But once the Red Book committee was established, and I'm talking now about my own experience, with my ability to make a contribution was most powerful through the Red Book Committee, through SACTI, and there I was able to deal with individuals who were both interested but also had the authority to make change.
SACTI is the National Blood Transfusion Service Standing Advisory Committee on Transfusion Transmitted Infection. Is that right?
It was, yes.
Both that and the Red Book Standards Committee, these are bodies that developed in the 1990s. Is that right?
Yes. SACTI a little earlier than the Red Book. The Red Book, it would be improper of me not to say that NIBSC, the National Institute of Biological Standards and Control, were also a key input to the formulation of the Red Book.
Those committees and those bodies existed in the 1990s. Am I right in thinking that there was no equivalent in the 1980s? No such fora in order where one could discuss BPL's interaction with the RTC's interaction with NIBSC, and the testing regimes that different bodies thought should be applied?
There was certainly no conjoint committee. We had PFL in particular, but PFL and BPL had very close working relationships with NIBSC, and we and the service profited enormously from those in terms of standardization and the supply of standards to the service. But that apart, I am not aware of any conjoint body into which the different organizations, BPL, PFL, the RTCs, NIBSC, made contributions.
The inquiry saw some months ago in the section dealing with pharmaceutical companies how US pharma companies could instigate new testing regimes in the plasmapheresis centres, either that they owned and managed or the ones that they contracted with, by setting out a plasma specification which would say, if you're providing us with plasma, you must test for the following viruses. BPL in the early 1980s wasn't in a position to do that, was it?
In the early 1980s, no, but we did assemble and gain agreement on a plasma specification which we kept alive and which was quite effective in its way. But it's not. There wasn't a standard that we could say you must. It was a standard that we would hold up and say we would like, please.
Is that a reflection of the fact that the way that the system in the UK had developed was that BPL and PFL would receive plasma from a voluntary donor system that had initially been set up to take whole blood donations in order to provide hospitals with blood for transfusion?
Yes. We did not have for quite some time I attended, when I had the opportunity, meetings of the US Blood Products Committee in Bethesda in Washington, and as much as one might decry the paid donor system, the Blood Products Committee was a very good forum in which to discuss standards and what needed to change in order to raise those standards.
And in addition to that forum, the pharmaceutical companies had the economic position to be able to direct the type of plasma they wish to receive. Is that fair?
Oh, it's quite fair, yes. I mean, who pays the piper calls the tune.
just so that we have it for the record, the BPL plasma specification is a document that you refer to in paragraph 55 and 56 of your witness statement. And
Yes.
from my understanding of your statement and the reference that it contains, that is a document which came into effect from about 1989. Is that right?
That's correct, and but was very effective and went through many transitions from that time.
Finally, before the break, this question, what role, if any, do you know of BPL as a corporate body playing in the debate about whether or not further testing should be introduced in the form of surrogate tests, either for AIDS or for non-A, non-B hepatitis a little later in the 80s?
BPL had no role. Richard Lane made input typically through the ACVSB, the Advisory Committee on Virological Standards for Blood, which was the precursor to MSBT. And I'm not aware of any other arrangement for by which BPL would have influenced, for example, the introduction or not of ALT screening or similar.
So I'm about to move on to a related but slightly different topic. I wonder if that might be a good moment.
Yes, well, we'll take a break now then until 25 to 4. 25 to 4.
Thank you, sir.